Thank you, Andrew. When I emailed Andrew maybe a couple weeks ago, asked him how many hours I had for my talk, and he reminded me, I think it's about 50 minutes. So I'll try to keep it down. Actually, it turned out my talk was shorter than that, so we'll see. And I'll add something. So. The creative historian. Who will deny that the phrase implies a contradiction, a lie, a heresy? Even I who conceived a dread to utter it, and not least for fear that some of you may be compelled to denounce me to the authorities, for my impertinence for even making such a connection between creativity and history. To suggest, too, as I do, that creative imagination plays any part in so seemingly an objective study as history, is that not some spawn of postmodern despair that concludes that all claims to truth are not but lunges at power? The creative imagination is a mighty power in its own realm, divine in its efficacy. It can take the events and personalities of bygone times and by deft manipulation, arrange them in a tableau that accords with its own preconceptions and pleasures. If anything, far from being an aid to the historian, creative imagination would seem to threaten him with its greatest peril and pitfall. Moreover, when we consider where the creative imagination has most free play, it will be more than justified to reject any tie between it and historical discipline. I refer here to what J.R.R. Tolkien called subcreation, the realm of myth and fable. It was Tolkien himself that gave us the best modern example of subcreation, especially in his magnum opus, the Silmarillion, where he creates nothing less than a mythical history of the early ages of the world. Speaking of this concept of subcreation, Tolkien wrote, "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Indeed, only by myth-making, only by becoming sub-creator and inventing stories, can man aspire to the state of perfection that he knew before the fall." Here it is clear that for Tolkien, sub-creation does not equate with falsehood. It will contain error, but it will shine with the light of truth. Let this be so. Still, who will deny that the truth for which a Tolkien will strive in sub-creation is not entirely the same truth the historian seeks in his attempts to reconstruct the past? If what we say here is true of Tolkien's sub-creation, it is equally true of those less radical creative departures from the so-called real world, those works that go by the name of the roman or the novel. Such works, historical in character as they are for the most part, insofar as they generally speak of past events, and set in the real world, usually contain their dose of error, or even, dare we say it, lies. For who reads, for instance, Shakespeare's Henry IV or Richard III, and thinks he's getting the straight dope on the events preceding and following the Wars of the Roses, Shakespeare at times frankly distorts the past for purposes of his own, purposes quite other from those of the historian. And not only Shakespeare is guilty of falsifying the past. One can point to countless other writers who, with their creative imagination, recast past events and personalities for their own arcane intentions and purposes. If we expect poets and novelists to be liars, we count historians to tell the truth. The facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. This is what the historian is after. The historian narrates, or at least tries to narrate, what actually occurred at some definite time and place without addition or subtraction. If the historian is an artist, it is only in how he narrates the facts, not in the facts themselves, or so we think. You'll actually be surprised how often historians will be very creative with the facts. And I was many years a journalist, and I realized the power I had as a journalist was that I could, by telling the straight truth, lie. And that was by omitting what was essential to what somebody said or somebody did. Now, I didn't do that. But I realized I could do it, and so talk about power. We would describe the historian as scientific rather than artistic or creative. The novelist may play fast and loose with the events of the past. The historian is tightly constrained within the parameters of a demanding discipline. Thus it seems I have confirmed the suspicions of at least many of you that I am some sort of intellectual heretic for even suggesting that an historian may be creative. Before you sick the hounds of the Inquisition on me, I would beg you to hear my case. For despite my protestations to the contrary, I maintain that creative imagination has a role, a very essential and important role to play in the exploration of history and the telling and teaching of it. I pray this august assembly to hear me for my cause, and only then pass judgment upon me. When I have done, if need be, you may denounce me to the authorities. In making my case to you, I should first say something about what I mean by creative imagination. The term does not equate simply with imagination, for the latter is a faculty common to humans and brute beasts, while creative imagination is peculiarly human. Imagination is that faculty whereby sensual images, the sights, sounds, tastes, and smells we take into our senses are in some measure preserved within us. Imagination differs from the intellect, which is informed not by sensual images, but by universal and abstract ideas. Whereas every image of the imagination is of or derived from some particular sensual experience we have had. With the intellect, we can define what a mountain or a man is in its nature. With the imagination, we can conjure up an image of a mountain or the features of a man. With the imagination, we can, to some degree, scent the salty air of an ocean on whose beaches we once have walked, savor a hoppy ale, feel the heat of a bygone summer, or hear the strains of a Beethoven sonata. By the intellect, we differ entirely from every subhuman creature, for the intellect is immaterial, spiritual, if you will. The imagination, on the other hand, unites us in a fellowship with creatures whose highest faculty never rises above the merely material level of existence. This is a sign, thinking of the imagination sense. Beethoven, it was said, when he went deaf, could still compose music because he could hear that music within him. And my eldest son, who is a musician, a violinist, he can do that too. When he would go on, when we used to go on card trips, he'd bring scores of operas or of symphonies, and he could hear what it sounded like by reading it. So you can see that how the imagination takes in those images, and as it were, it prints them within us. The creative imagination is something more than imagination. It is rooted in the imagination, for it deals with those sensual images that inform the imagination. But the creative imagination does something more than merely picture or hear or feel or smell again. The creative imagination is the imagination marshaled by the intellect and the human will. It includes what we call intuition or insight, a view into things, their character and makeup. It is architectonic, for it takes the very essential images of the imagination and arranges them into meaningful patterns, and in this way creates a new reality out of the raw materials of the old. For instance, drawing on the images of a lion and an eagle, we create an imaginary beast, the griffin. And if we are well acquainted with lions and eagles, if our experience provides us with the imaginative pictures of their behavior and antics, along with an intellectual understanding of the same, we can do more than merely picture a griffin. By reconstructing lion and eagle elements into a new creature, we can relate something of its natural history. We can describe its habitat, its feeding and mating instincts, its lifespan, its ferocity, etc. Indeed, we may be even able to convince others of the griffin's existence if our creative imagination is especially keen. And when people hear that a griffin's feathers possess the virtue of restoring sight to the blind, they may even set out on expeditions to find this extraordinary beast. Imagine government grants to fund a society for the discovery and domestication of the griffin. Tales of sightings in dark forest lands all over the world, like Sasquatch. Experts speculating on conservation policies to be implemented once the griffin is found. Such can be the power of the creative imagination. It is the telling of stories, however, that provides us with perhaps the most familiar example of how the creative imagination works. We are all familiar with the basic elements of a story, I think. Every story we know has to have a main character or a protagonist, the chief actor in the story. It usually includes other characters as well. In particular, the one we call the antagonist, who strives against the protagonist and provides the dramatic grist for the story. But a story is far more than its characters and their description. A story is most fundamentally a tale of deeds, a series of events comprehended by the term, the plot. And not simply any concatenation of events makes for a plot. The events rather have to possess a logical coherence and a sense of directed movement. There must be a conflict, a problem to be solved, a difficulty seeking resolution. The conflict is resolved definitively in what is called the peripety or climax, and finds its ultimate resolution in the denouement. I always, when I teach, I have taught this subject, haven't done it recently, but I use the example of mystery stories, because I think mystery stories give us probably the clearest understanding of what I'm saying here. You basically, imagine you have a mystery story, Colonel Mustard is found dead in the library with a metal pipe next to him. So the question is who killed Colonel Mustard? And no one can understand why anybody would kill Colonel Mustard, because he was a rather genial old fellow, and not particularly rich. So, but we're curious about this, and so that's the conflict, right? The conflict of who killed Mustard. And so the whole conflict as it develops, it leads us towards the climax of the resolution where we discover who killed Colonel Mustard. We find it was Miss Scarlet. I gave away the plot, I'm sorry. But I won't give away the denouement. And the denouement, the final resolution, so the climax of the Pripyat is the first resolution. And that's the thing that we're all waiting for. Right? That's the thing that, as Aristotle said, gives us our catharsis. Maybe not in this case of fear and pity, but of something else. But the denouement is that final resolution where we find out how this, Miss Scarlet did it. When think she could actually lift a thing like that, and why she did it. So you can see you have the conflict: who killed Colonel Mustard, and the whole plot develops along that line to become that climax. We discover it was Miss Scarlet, and we find out how she did it and why she did it. And at the end of the denouement, where everything's finally resolved, we're happy. I've said that a plot has to possess logical coherence and a sense of directed movement as well as just, have those elements. Such a sense of coherence is what makes for a good plot as opposed to a bad one. But how do we achieve this coherence? We achieve it first by making sure the plot is self-containing. That is, the climax must appear to be a logical consequence of the elements introduced in the conflict, and nothing more. In a mystery story, the culprit has to be one of the characters introduced in the conflict. If the storyteller must introduce an element not present before in order to resolve the conflict, say who killed Colonel Mustard, we call it a deus ex machina, a god from the machine, and we deeply deplore it. Imagine in a murder mystery, after exonerating each of the suspects, the butler, Miss Scarlet, Mr. Plum, and Mrs. Peacock, the author discovers the murderer to be some newsboy we had heard nothing of before. In a stage play, such a tragedy could even spark a riot. At least in other times, maybe not now, for 2 nights today. You can imagine you go to this thing and you're waiting the whole time which of these characters did, and they introduced some character that wasn't even present in the play because the poor playwright couldn't figure out how to resolve this, bring it to a climax. To a self-contained plot demands that every event in the plot makes sense given the events that have preceded it. The climax must blossom from its native root stock, not like a rose from ragweed. Shakespeare's Macbeth provides a good example of what I mean here, and I think this is an apt example because I think almost everybody's probably read Macbeth, at least in high school. Why does Macbeth kill the king? Clearly on account of those convincing tempters, the Weird Sisters, his wife, and his own ambition. To secure his power founded on bloodshed, Macbeth murders his friend Banquo, and with the Weird Sisters' intervention, Macduff's wife and children. Macduff flees, but desiring revenge joins Malcolm in a push against Macbeth's power. On account of his tyranny, none stand with the murderous king in his last hour. And the play climaxes in Macbeth's last battle with him that was not a woman born. Shakespeare carefully constructs his plot so that everything that occurs follows from what has been introduced before. No element of it appears as if it were from its mother's womb untimely ripped, to use a homely, though unpleasant metaphor. The self-containment of the plot is thus essential to its soundness, but perhaps even more important is how the storyteller develops his main characters. The storyteller constructs his plot primarily by working through the protagonist. For as we have said, the protagonist is so called because he is the chief actor in the series of events we call the plot. The protagonist is the chief mover of the plot. If the plot is to possess logical coherence, everything the protagonist does, how he reacts to what happens to him, has to make sense given the sort of man he is. His choices must accord with his inner character. If he does anything inconsistent with this character, we find the plot dissatisfying. If anything befalls him that does not seem to follow from his own acts, the immediate circumstances in which he acts, or on account of the explicable proclivities and capacities of other characters in the story, then we think the plot a poor one, and we are correct in our assessment. When we first meet Macbeth, we see he is ambitious. We see, too, that he is irresolute on account of his conscience. Lady Macbeth, on the other hand, seems utterly resolute and ruthless, at least according to our first and superficial judgment of her. It is she who spurs him to do the deed his heart abhors but his ambition desires, the murder of the king. She reminds him of his desires for greatness. She lashes him with words, questioning his manhood and courage. She declares that she would dash her own infant's brains out if she had so resolved. Scourged by his wife's words, Macbeth murders Duncan. We see subsequently how the first murder hardens Macbeth to commit the murders that follow, and it all makes sense given what we know of him. Lady Macbeth's character follows a different trajectory. Alienated from her husband's counsel, she betrays her own inner terrors and remorse, elements of her character hinted at in her earlier prayer to unsex me here and fill me from crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty, and her admission, had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. This sort of character delineation precedes what we have called the storyteller's intuition, an insight into the imaginary persons he has created. By his intuition, the storyteller sees not only what kind of man his protagonist is, but in what manner such a man would act if placed in a certain environment and beset by very particular circumstances. He perceives how other actors in the story, with their own defined personalities, can impinge on how his main character acts. But the storyteller's intuition plays a role even before he conceives the tale that he wishes to tell. To create a character and draw from that character a plot consistent with his inner self, a storyteller must have had experience with men and their ways. He must see beyond what men do into why they do it, how their character conditions and causes how they act. In other words, the storyteller uses his creative intellect to reproduce something like what happens in reality. He draws, as it were, a moving picture, creates an imitation of how human beings really do behave. It is for this reason that it is poetics. Aristotle has said the storyteller is something more than a spinner of tales. He is a kind of philosopher. I think we can here begin to see how story is similar to history. What is history than a relation of what human beings have done? That is, an account of human action in the past. History speaks of wars, of social movements, of the deeds of prominent people, of the habits and proclivities of the common man as evinced by how he acts. History shows us how, by the choices and deeds of individuals and groups, societies and civilizations rise and fall, how human choice, influenced by circumstances, environment, and the interplay of human wills, sets individuals and peoples moving along definite trajectories. History is tragedy, it's comedy, it's a tale of triumphs, but also of defeats, and unfortunately, often it seems more of defeats than triumphs. I guess it depends on your perspective on that one. History draws us into lives long past in the manner of a story. It can even leave us at times sitting on the edge of our seat. It is not insignificant, I think, that the word story is derived from the word history. In fact, stories have been called histories in earlier times. Like a storyteller, the historian is concerned with causes. He is not content merely to relate what happened, but why it happened. He seeks, for instance, an explanation for the 1812 invasion of Russia and the character of its chief protagonist, Napoleon Bonaparte. The historian asks why, when he reached Smolensk, did Napoleon decide to proceed to Moscow? And this is because, if you're familiar with this history, it is odd, because he's coming into the period of summer in Russia when he knows that if he proceeds to Moscow, he'll have to stay there, right, during Moscow winter. And he actually achieved everything he needed to achieve in Russia by just proceeding to Smolensk. But then he makes his decision, this fatal decision for him, to continue on to Moscow. Why did he do that? Napoleon was no fool. Napoleon was a brilliant man. You read the accounts of Napoleon while he was leading the invasion of Russia. He was directing the government in Paris by letter. And he was constantly working and constantly thinking he could hold various different tasks in his mind. So a man this brilliant, why? Why did he do this? And how did that tragic mistake accord with the brilliance of the man who made it? And the historian finds his answer in part in Napoleon's ambition, his exaggerated self-confidence, and his overweening pride. In other words, the historian seeks for logical coherence and a sense of directed movement in the events of the past, just like the storyteller does in his stories. But this is where the historian and storyteller part company. Both are concerned with human action, but while the storyteller describes for us what a certain type of man might do under certain circumstances, the historian tells us what real men have actually done in real times and places. The storyteller's tale is hypothetical, the historian's is factual. Both can be said to be true, but in different ways. Macbeth, for instance, is a real historical figure, but one can argue that Shakespeare's Macbeth is not, insofar as Shakespeare ascribes to his Macbeth things the real Macbeth never did. For instance, in Shakespeare's play, Macbeth murders the king of the castle. What we know about the historical Macbeth is that he killed the king in battle. A very different scenario. Yet Shakespeare's Macbeth gives us a believable account of what such a man as his Macbeth would do if confronted with a certain peculiar set of circumstances. We can say, yes, that is just what such a man would or might do. Shakespeare has uncovered a truth about human character. Still, if we were to judge the play Macbeth by the historical account of Macbeth, we might conclude that Shakespeare is an arrant liar. Such a judgment, of course, would be quite false, since as a playwright, Shakespeare is not claiming to be an historian. The storyteller creates, while the historian relates. The storyteller finds truth in verisimilitude, while the historian seeks it in evidence. Indeed, in some ways, the historian's task is the harder one. It is also less satisfying. By necessity, he is always looking at historical events and their players from the outside. He can see what men have done, but if he seeks to discover why they have done what they have done, that is, their intentions, he is at a disadvantage. The historian desires to know the intentions of historical characters, for he seeks to know causes, and the intention is the most important cause of human action. But for the most part, the historian can only see what men have done. He cannot analyze their thoughts or see into their hearts. Actions do imply certain intentions, but the same action can imply sometimes multiple intentions. When, for instance, Archbishop Thomas of Becket contended for the rights of the Church against King Henry II of England, was he proceeding from zeal for the liberty of the Church or from pride and personal ambition? Because Becket is a saint, we assume the former, but the case is not so clear-cut for the historian acting as an historian. So I'm talking about here as a historian can't just assume, because of subsequent canonization, he can't base his account based on that. He has to draw it actually from the facts of the case, so what he actually can read in the documents, and if possible, even discover, say, an archaeological record. He doesn't have the leisure as a historian just to take the shortcut and say, he was a saint, so it must have been his intentions were right. Human intentions, too, can be mixed, which of course makes the historian's task of finding the truth even harder. Sometimes a historian possesses documents, such as personal diaries and the like, in which an historical figure confesses his mind and will, but even these are external accounts. Human beings are quite capable of bearing false witness against themselves, and they may even deceive themselves about themselves. Thus, what they say about themselves may not be utterly accurate. Indeed, they might be errant lies. This is not the place to discuss all the ways historians analyze the past. What we have said thus far is sufficient to clarify the central point, that unlike the storyteller, the historian does not create. He discovers. But the storyteller must proceed from truth and create with verisimilitude. His product is something made, something of his own, something new. The historian is not supposed to make or make anything up, but to relate to the best of his ability events with which he himself had nothing to do. A storyteller may change his story if he does not like the direction it is taking. The historian cannot change the past, even if he deplores its results. 2, even though the historian wants to produce an account of logical coherence in a sense of direct movement, he cannot always do so. Some events in history just seem to make no sense at all, given the actors involved and all the irrelevant circumstances. For instance, why did, by all accounts, a promising law student who was gregarious and jolly and seemingly not excessively pious, and I'm speaking here of Martin Luther, why did he suddenly make a rash vow to become a monk? Was the bolt of lightning in the forest really sufficient to wring from him so desperate a resolution? Or why did Napoleon, after his defeat at Waterloo, trust himself to the mercy of his greatest enemy, England? Such questions are not so easily answered. And even if you can come up with no answers to these other questions, the historian is bound to relate the events as fact. Some events just make no sense, but they happened. These and many other examples demonstrate that what we deplore in a piece of fiction, we find unremarkable in the work of history. For history sometimes makes no sense at all. Let's make a little aside here. Question of historical fiction. There's a school of thought out there that, there's one school of thought I agree with, that historical fiction is very important in the teaching of history. There's another school of thought, which I don't agree with, that you could pretty much rely on historical fiction in lieu of history. I think from what I've said thus far, we can see the difference between fiction and history. And the writer of historical fiction is not primarily an historian. The historical is the adjective there. He's not the fictional historian. He's the historical fiction writer. So his primary concern is the concern of the storyteller, not of the historian. So when he's constructing his plot, He's looking for a good plot. And if that means, as often happens, you can see this in history of literature, if that means he has to tweak the events of history just a little bit in order to achieve it, or sometimes even a lot, like Shakespeare does, or Sir Walter Scott does, like in Ivanhoe, there are historical inaccuracies there. He does it. And really, he should do it because he is primarily a storyteller here, not a historian. So I think historical fiction, I sort of know this because, as you know, I've written some of the Catholic school textbooks, history textbooks. I've also written an historical novel. And I can tell you the process of writing in those two cases are very different. What I'm concerned with when I'm writing my novel is not primarily relating the history of the time. I want it to be accurate as much as possible, but that's not my primary goal. Like in the second part, which I'm writing now, I'll have an event in the Peasants' Rebellion in 1525 in Germany. That happened, I portrayed as happening in a mythical town that I created, but it's based on a historical account. So such a thing did happen, but it didn't happen at the place I said it happened. It happened pretty far away from the place I said it happened, and it didn't happen with the exact same characters. I'm having it happen with fictional characters. Why do I do that? Because of the dramatic power of it. I perceive to be the dramatic power of it. So anybody who thinks you're going to read a work of historical fiction and you're going to get an account of the past that's going to be accurate enough. It can be accurate enough, but you always have to compare it with actual historical writing. Because, again, the intention is very different. So I would suggest, like in the textbook project, we have our teachers' manuals, we give suggestions for historical novels. But those by themselves never know. But they do, and sometimes they give students a feel for the time period. So they feel like they can enter into it. Why you might want to listen to period music, historical periods. You feel like you're entering into it. A way of exciting imagination, as it were, right? But they have to be carefully warned not to take everything that's related in these books as fact. And again, I'm not criticizing historical fiction writers because I'm one. I never criticize myself. But I'm simply saying, as a storyteller, falsifying the events of history might be just the right thing to do in that circumstance. Get any questions about it later? We'll talk about it. Well, given all that I've said thus far, it appears that I must surrender myself up to your mercies. I've spent a good deal of time basically arguing that the phrase, the creative historian, is self-contradictory. Perhaps the phrase shows my own creativity, but it does not. If it does, then it does not show it to good effect. A piece of art must have verisimilitude. It should harmonize with reality. It should not be absurd, like the phrase, the creative historian, seems to be. But I beg you to have patience. Do not dial up a denouncement of me to the Inquisition. Hear me for just a little while longer. For I contend the historian and the storyteller have more in common than what I have related thus far. For one thing, they have a common desire, and that desire is to compose an account of a series of human events possessing logical coherence and a sense of direct movement. That the historian has a harder time doing this than the storyteller doesn't mean that he is not hankering after it. As we have said, historians are not content simply to relate that A happened, then B, then C. They want to be able to say why B happened on account of A, and how the concatenation of A and B brought about an event so outrageous as C. In seeking to understand historical events, historians will look at various different causes, environmental causes, economic causes, cultural causes, etc. But since history has to do with human actions, the preeminent cause of causes resides in the human mind and will. If an historian wishes to understand why an historical actor has acted as he did, he must try to peer into the human heart to understand it. In other words, an historian must exercise a faculty we may have thought peculiar to the storyteller. That faculty is intuition. The historian must contemplate the actions of historical characters and ask himself, what do these actions suggest about the person's motives? What kind of men act in the way, say, Luther acted or Napoleon? The task, of course, is difficult and complex, but the historian cannot rely on facile judgments. For the human character is a very complex thing. Forgive me for harping on Luther, but I find the man fascinating. An excellent example of my point here, too. He's one of the characters in the second part of my novel. Now, imagine this. You find it's easy to create a character in a novel, but then you have to write about historical characters, people who actually existed, and that's really daunting. That's scary. Remember in the 80s there was this movie called Amadeus, and I remember Mozart devotees were all up in arms over the fact that the way they portrayed Mozart. I'm more of a Beethoven man myself, so it didn't bother me. But I remember thinking at the time, what's the big deal? It's a story. It's not meant to be history, but I think what we've done in so many cases, we've kind of confused history and story. And maybe it's because we think everything is a lie. You know, that's one of the characteristics of the postmodern world. All claims to truth are really claims to power. And so, we might equate these two, but really we have to keep those things distinct. So, the historian contemplates the actions of historical characters and asks himself, what do these actions suggest about the person's motives? I already read that, sorry. Forgive me for harping on Luther, but I find the man fascinating. Much of what Luther did as a reformer seems very much motivated by pride. But was he motivated by pride alone? To answer yes here, I think, would be to indulge in a facile analysis of the man. And even if he was proud, which he was, pride can rise from a miasma of causes. For instance, people who suffer from a profound lack of self-confidence often compensate for it by developing an exaggerated view of themselves. 2, if we can locate, as I think we can, the root of Luther's rebellion in his pride and his radical subjectivism, we still have to account for the seeming conviction in the rightness of his cause that made him willing to court even death in defense of it. His self-doubts in the cell at the Wartburg, where he wondered, are you alone, wise? His devotion to his wife and children, the depth of his expressions of piety. It is not just Luther's pride that helped make the Reformation, but all the complexity of the man. And if you have any doubts about that, what I've said, I think if you read a lot about Luther, you read some of Luther, it's just utterly disgusting, but you read other things about his devotions and some of the hymns he wrote and some of the prayers he wrote. They really seem to evince a real piety. His family life is considered to be exceptional. He did court death when he went to Worms to stand before the emperor. He really thought he might have been burnt at the stake. So how do we bring all those elements together? His very obvious pride, his overweening confidence in his own mind, and these other parts of his character, which are in many ways admirable. How do we bring all those things together? I read a German Lutheran historian said, if it was Joseph Lorz was his name, right, in the 1930s. He criticized Catholics for taking a simplistic view of Luther. He says, if such a no account of a man could destroy the Catholic Church, what does that say about the Catholic Church? I mean, destroy it in Germany, right? So we kind of owe it to ourselves to see something more than that. Once the historian is examined in an historical character, he must account for the historical events in which the character acts in a way that makes sense, that has verisimilitude. In other words, the historian must create an account of historical events possessing logical coherence and a sense of directed movement. His creation, of course, differs from a storyteller's. For a storyteller is not bound by facts the way a historian is. 2, a storyteller begins from the inside out, while the historian moves from the outside in, from acts to motives rather than from motives to acts. Nevertheless, the historian has to move creatively. He must come up with an hypothesis. This sort of man would act in this sort of way that would seem to account for the facts. He may have to come up with a number of different hypotheses to account for the facts. Then he must test his hypotheses against the facts. In other words, the historian must, at a certain point of his investigation, act very much like a storyteller, without, in the end, enjoying the same freedom as the storyteller does. Examples of that, I'm going to use Luther again. Some of the earliest Catholic attitudes toward Luther said, well, why did he rebel against the church? Well, because he wanted to marry a nun. That was, there's no, if you actually, that's an hypothesis. So why did the Reformation occur? Because Luther wanted to marry a nun. Well, if you actually look at the historical record of Luther, he didn't get married. He nailed the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg church door in 1517. He didn't get married until I think it was 1524, 1525. So he evinced no interest in marriage before that. In fact, he didn't want to get married. One of the reasons he got married was because his followers said to be a good example, he should get married too, like all these other priests were doing, all these former monks. And he resisted it. And he might not have gotten married had it not been the fact that convent nuns had fled. They were brought in on an ox cart or something to Wittenberg. And there was, several of the nuns were taken on as husbands to various people. There was one left over. And she couldn't find a husband, so sort of like his final catalyst to marrying her was that he felt sorry for her. And just imagine, being married to the great Luther. But anyway, you can see. I can't tell certain stories in mixed company, but you can read in my novel. No. So you see, that's an hypothesis. This is my hypothesis. Well, does it meet up with the facts? Well, I've given you the facts discernible from the record about Luther, and no, that hypothesis does not meet up with the facts. A better hypothesis would be to posit his basic pride, his scrupulosity, but what's the source of that? Well, one can trace it back to the way he was beaten as a child, but that wasn't very extraordinary in Germany in the 16th century, beaten as a child. Maybe not in any period of German history up until recently. We had one of our former professors at TAC, Molly Guston, used to say, well, why are the Germans the best composers? And he said, because they beat their children. I'm not advocating this, by the way. Or we could say his philosophical background. Luther was not a Thomist. Luther was an alchemist, a nominalist, which emphasizes God's will. So that for the nominalist, the alchemist, God is will itself. So if he sets down commandments, say, thou shalt not steal, he could change his mind about that. His will could change on that. And he could promise you salvation and say, if you do such and such and such and such, you may attain eternal life. But then he could will otherwise. And you could never know the inscrutable will of God. If you have that kind of almost Moloch God as your ideal of what God is, then you could have a very skewed opinion as to what the Catholic Church actually teaches. So I think there's a number of things. If we look at the historical record, sometimes I think the historical record suggests hypotheses to us, but sometimes as it does, we look at man's acts. But it's what happens when you're, I think, reading history, you think, I bet this is right. I bet this is the reason why he did such and such. And lo and behold, you check the record and you say, my idea is right or my idea is wrong. Other, like Robespierre and the French Revolution, I think is another fascinating character. You see, I'm really fascinated by rogues. But Robespierre was bloody. Actually, when he first joined the revolution, he resigned as a judge in Arras, France, because he was opposed to the death penalty of all things. And then he became the primary proponent of the death penalty, the guillotine, in the French Revolution. Thousands died of the guillotine under him. Well, why? Why was he like this? Was it because he just happened to like bloodshed? Well, no. I don't think that could be a hypothesis that one might have. He was just a bloody guy. But I think what would steer you away from that hypothesis is the fact when finally everybody got the sense that we got to stand up to Robespierre. Everybody in the French Assembly said he's going to kill us all. What he did, he stood before the assembly like I'm standing before you now, and he tried to speak, and he was shouted down by one side and shouted down by the other, and he began to realize this is the end of me. And finally, what he said was, when he finally was able to get some words out, because he was actually choking at one point, he said, "Vote for my death." And that's what they did. Well, why did he say that? If you go back a little further, the nights before, he was urged by his followers to start a revolution in Paris, as has been happening more or less frequently since 1789. And he said, no, I will not lift my hand against the Republic. Why did he do this? Because I think, my hypothesis would be, and I think it's just sort of supported by the facts, is he did it because he was an idealist, a very, radical, fanatic caste. He really did believe in this republic, and he was willing to die for what he believed. So we can look at that way and we sort of see the complexity of the man, and I think that makes it fascinating, really. We can indulge in the black hats and white hats of history, but it's just boring in the end. And if anything, we don't want to be boring, do we? Okay. The historian, too, will use his creative imagination to form hypotheses when studying not just what this person did or that historical series of events, such as the American Civil War, but in seeking to understand the grand sweep of history. What is the chain of cause and effect between the Enlightenment of the 18th century, the scientific revival of the 17th century, the Protestant Reformation of the 15th? How are all these historical epochs related to the decline of Christendom in the 14th century and what is called the Great Century in the 13th century? Can we see the roots of the deplorable 14th century secularization of the papacy and the praiseworthy, necessary, though hardly flawless, medieval Reformation led by such great pontiffs as Pope St. Gregory VII and Pope Innocent III? To answer such questions, the historian has to proceed from an intuition, a hunch, which he will then test by the facts found in the historical record of the periods in question. He may posit, as at least one historian has done, that the power politics of the Avignon papacy, which led to the host of ills that finally stirred up the Protestant Reformation, are a result of the flaws in the measures that the medieval church undertook to free itself from lay political domination. He may go further and suggest that the personality of, say, an Innocent III conditioned how he tried to reform the church and was the cause of some of the flaws found in that reform. In doing so, the historian will behave very much like the storyteller, demonstrating how an historical protagonist moves a course of events, embracing not only his own day, but centuries. And I think this is some of the most fascinating study of history. Dr. Celine and I were discussing Christopher Dawson, an English historian of last century. I think he died in the 60s. He writes, if you want to read accounts that give you detailed events of what happened in a particular epoch, you don't go to Christopher Dawson. He gives you these grand sweep things. And so what he does is he shows us how all the tendencies of a vast period of time. But one speculation I always found really interesting, just to give you an example when I'm talking about the grand sweep view of things, is this strange penchant that our civilization has had for unity. You might not think that looking at European history, that Europeans have any kind of hankering for unity, but really they do. The ideal of Catholic, well, not just Catholic Europe, but of the Catholic Church has been unity. We see that in the Second Vatican Council, right? The Church is a sacrament of unity. But if you look at such early fathers as Tertullian or Origen, they looked to the Roman Empire as the source of unity on a political and secular level. Tertullian even seemed to think that the Roman Empire was necessary for the existence of the church, that if the Roman Empire fell, that would be the end of the world. Origen dreamed of a Christian empire that would unite this whole, what they considered the world at the time. When the Western Empire fell in 476, the dream of the Roman Empire was kept up, and it was handed on from generation to generation as this dream of unity. In this case, it was not simply political unity, but a Christian political unity. It was revived under Charlemagne. The office of Holy Roman Emperor continued, even though without any power. It was revived under the Emperor Otto I of Germany. And continued this. So what developed was this notion that the church and the empire together rule the world. And they provide unity to the world. A unity which it was hoped would bring peace to the world. This was really central, even though it was not very well often realized. The Roman Empire was seen to be the secular arm of Christendom. And both the Pope and the Emperor together were to bring peace to all Christian nations. Of course, we know the church is meant to embrace the entire world. So ultimately implicit in that is peace and unity of the entire world. Well, what happened to this ideal? It never died. We see it crop up again and again throughout human history. We see it in Napoleon. Napoleon was not just some fellow who wanted to conquer countries. In fact, he wasn't intent at first to conquer Europe. But when he set out to do his conquest, he at least told himself, and I think he believed it to a large part, that he was doing it for the highest of motives. He wanted, he said, to bring peace to Europe, in a kind of odd sort of way. I guess the means to the end, right? The end of the purpose of war is peace, I suppose. And so he wanted to bring peace to Europe under his beneficent rule, of course. And he wanted, of course, to have the equal law for everybody. So he had high ideals of what he was doing, despite how conflicted the character actually was. He even had a place for the church, sort of a flipping of the order. He wanted to bring the Pope to Paris, so the Pope would be under his direction the whole time. And so this was his ideal. When he fell, the deal was was revived after the Peace of Vienna in 1815 under Metternich, Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, under his plan, which had what was called the Concert of Europe. That failed. We had the World Wars. But then we have this dream of unity together again, and we might not like it, the form it's taking now, because it's purely secular, but we find it in the League of Nations, we find the dream of unity in the United Nations, and we find it for Europe, it's in the European Union. Now, one does not have to like any of these bodies, but I think what the imagination, the historian working creatively and imaginatively would say, there's similarities here. There's a common desire here. Are there links between all these things? Is this some kind of historical memory realizing itself in fact in various different ways? Is the United Nations meant to be the Holy Roman Empire without the Holy and the Roman? And that's the kind of thing, that's what I think when we talk about intuition, you can look at intuition in terms of vast events. And I think you can, and I think it is imagination because I think you do use the essential images and the like and seeing similarities between things and seeing similar intentions. But that sort of thing is what a historian would do. But again, what he has to do, he can't just say, give you neat ideas, just rest with that. The historian is bound to try to defend what he says by the historical record, which is primarily found in written texts. The historian must look at history as a story, for that is what it is, a grand tale, both a tragedy and a comedy. He must have a feel for the drama of history if he is to be able to understand it and relate it effectively to others, and this requires imagination of the creative sort. Perhaps this is why ancient histories often read very much like folk tales. Why, for instance, Herodotus or Thucydides or Josephus will put dramatic speeches of their own creation into the mouths of historical characters, the sort of things those men or women would have said given the kind of people they were. The rise of a more academic history forbids such flights of fancy. Nevertheless, though more scientific, modern history is no less dramatic. And as such, it has to be approached with an imaginative sensitivity and retold in a way that conveys its inner drama. And I want to give you an example of what I mean. This is from one of our textbooks. No, this is not a cheap marketing ploy. But that is just more honest to give you something I wrote. And then you won't be able to criticize it so easily. But this is what I do, what I'm going to point out here. Well, maybe I'll point this out afterwards. This section, it's about the Emperor Alexander, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who reigned during the period of the Napoleonic Wars and afterwards. It was night. All was quiet in the Mikhailov Palace in St. Petersburg. The members of the imperial family were in their beds asleep, all except the Grand Prince, Alexander Pavlovich Romanov. He would not sleep that night. Agitated and fretful, he paced his room, fully clothed, waiting. At last he threw himself on his bed. The night seemed endless. The reigning Tsar and Emperor of Russia, Pavel I, had made the Mikhailov Palace into a sort of fortress. The short, balding, and ugly Pavel had had a difficult life. His mother, Katerina the Great, had deposed his father, Tsar Pyotr III, who was then killed under strange circumstances. Katerina reigned for the next 34 years during which her son Pavel thought he rightly should have been ruler. Upon becoming Tsar at Katerina's death in 1796, Pavel proved that he was not an entirely bad ruler. Indeed, many of his policies had been wise. Yet Pavel was insane, and his insanity led him into acts of cruelty and into a strange admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte. Pavel had made many enemies, powerful enemies, Russian nobles and leaders of the Russian army. To protect himself, he had raised towers and battlements around the Mikhailov palace. It is said that Tsar Pavel feared his own sons, the Grand Prince Alexander and his brothers, and was contemplating imprisoning them. At least this is what Pavel's enemies may have told Alexander. Such a tale, along with Pavel's increasing insanity, would perhaps convince the Grand Prince to agree to a plot that the Tsar's foes had suggested to him, the deposition of his father. Thus, on the night of March 23, 1801, the 23-year-old Alexander, fearful and alone, awaited the news that the plot against the Tsar had succeeded. The hours passed slowly until about 1 a.m. on the morning of March 24th, when Alexander heard a knock on his door. The prince sat up on his bed as in walked Count Nikolai Zubov. Standing before Alexander, Zubov said in a hoarse voice, "All is over." "What is over?" said the astonished prince. Zubov would not say, but he addressed Alexander as Sire and Your Majesty, titles given only to the reigning Tsar. Frightful and full of foreboding, Alexander questioned Zubov further, until Zubov was forced to tell the whole story. Tsar Pavel was dead. The conspirators, including Zubov, had climbed by a back stairway into the apartments of the imperial family in the Mikhailov palace. They had entered the Tsar's apartment and demanded that he abdicate and name his son Alexander the Tsar in his place. Pavel refused. What happened next is uncertain, but in the end Pavel lay dead on his bed. He had been strangled. Horror overcame Alexander. He had agreed to his father's deposition, not his death. What now would he do? How would the Russian people react to his father's murder? Would they blame him? How could he justly take up his father's authority, purchased at the price of his father's blood? Now, when I wrote this is really the reason I used what I wrote for this, because I could tell you what I did. I used a technique called in medias res in literature, which means you start in the middle. You see that in the Odyssey. The beginning of the Odyssey is actually the middle of the story. If you take it just as a series of events, we start with Odysseus on Circe's island, and then he tells, he goes to the Falcons, I think it is, and he tells his story of everything that happened before that. And you do that to give unity to a story if you want to include past events in it. So I use a literary technique to tell a historical story. Two, the account I gave was based on what I discovered from various historical records. And I don't try to assert anything that I can't assert with some confidence. So that's why in different places I say, perhaps he thought this, perhaps he felt this. If I go a bit further than that, it's because it seems that all the things together seem to suggest he felt a certain thing. And plus, if you look at his later character, you'll see that that it accords, what I say here, and I think you can see, accords with what his intentions are consistent, I should say, with his later character. And I think this is, we did this with the book project because we wanted to grab the student's imagination in telling the history. And I think that's the best way, you can actually get them to love history and want to know it. When I was teaching before we had the textbooks, I would do something similar. I didn't have any textbooks I liked, so I would just go home and I would study and I would make notes. And I would stand in front of the class and tell his history stories while writing dates and things, the important dates on the board. And I tried to discuss with the students the characters of these very historical figures, so that they would become alive to them, so that they would be able to experience these people as living, breathing human beings, just like themselves. That's really important, I think, for teaching history. It's not just memorizing dates. I'm not really in favor of memorizing lots of dates. There's some important dates everybody should know. But really, it's the story that they need to know, and it's the story they want to know. When I was a kid, I used to read encyclopedias. I just like the stories so much, even though the account was boring. But I think you can bring that to life for students in the teaching of history. And it really depends on the teacher too, having this feeling. If the teacher doesn't have this feeling, if the teacher's imagination is not aroused, if the teacher's imagination is not formed properly, you can't convey that to the student. There's a lot of newer histories, Southerner. The Southern. Shelby Foote, yeah, he does that, and I think in a very effective way. And it's very important, I think, for especially people nowadays. But you look at, we were looking at this over teaching a class, and look at the character of Alexander, and I'd say, let's discuss, what does the historical record tell us about him? Well, he seemed to lack a lot of self-confidence. He was constantly undergoing hero worship. His first hero was Napoleon Bonaparte. He learned this admiration through his tutor, not Napoleon's tutor, but Alexander's tutor was a Frenchman. But the Frenchman went back to Paris, and when Napoleon was consul, and came back with an entirely different opinion of Napoleon. I think he was a tyrant. And so Alexander changed his opinion about Napoleon again. He, once again, went back to admiring Napoleon. Alexander wanted to give Russia a constitution. He wanted to free the serfs. He had all these grand liberal ideas. But then he became enemy with Napoleon during the wars. Then they paid peace, and they became the best of friends again. And then later on, they had a falling out, which led to the invasion of Russia, in which, Alexander was the target. So, and then he entirely turned against Napoleon. He turned against liberalism, and after Napoleon's fall, he was taken in by Prince Clemens von Metternich, who was like the opposite of Napoleon. Prince Clemens, Metternich wanted to restore the ancient regime in Europe, and a government based upon princes and kings and the Catholic Church. And Alexander said, teach me, master me, right? This is the kind of man he was. He had a very tender conscience, too. It's a kind of a Russian thing, I suppose. The Russian Orthodox have this interesting practice when they go to confession, they confess the sins of other people. So you can imagine, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, I have committed genocide. But we see this in Alexander. As he was told, the great floods devastated St. Petersburg in 1824. And he said, the fellow said to him, these floods destroyed Petersburg because of the sins of the Russians. Alexander denied it. He said, no, for mine. Plots against his government, he said, had arisen because he had shared and encouraged these illusions and errors of liberalism. Finally, in 1824, he told his brother, the Grand Duke Nikolai, that he would abandon the throne. I have resolved to give up the duties imposed upon me and retire from the world, he said. He didn't actually end up doing that. He died beforehand. There was a legend of a starets, a Russian Orthodox starets up in Siberia, who supposedly was the emperor, but it's probably not true. Maybe it is. In order to fulfill their tasks, the historian and the storyteller both must be graduates of the same school, the school of experience, of living in the real world, and encountering and contemplating human beings and their ways. They must, too, become acquainted with the world of nature, for human beings are affected by the natural world and affected in turn. The book learning is important, too, the more for the historian than the storyteller. Many, if not most, of our great storytellers never darken the halls of an academy, but in our age of academic history, formal schooling is essential for the historian. Not only what men have done make history, but more importantly, what they have thought, what they have believed. The liberal arts are thus most important for the forming of the historian's mind, as is some grasp of philosophy and theology and the empirical scientific disciplines, not to mention the study of history itself. The liberal arts not only add to the story of one's knowledge, but condition how we come to know and how we perceive the world around us. Grammar, for instance, trains the mind in understanding the shades of nuance in language, thus schooling the mind in subtlety. The liberal education provides the historian with a kind of experience of human beings in ways that is indispensable to his task of, dare we say it, creation. And we cannot forget the role of the semi-divine creator, the storyteller himself, in the education of the historian. Works of created literature, lyric and epic poetry, tales, short stories, novels, provide us with a vicarious experience of humanity. They help us see into the hearts of men and to perceive how what they do springs from the well of who they are. Moreover, they teach us the compassion that warns us against easy judgments based on what we see men do. A well-constructed story draws us into the characters it portrays. We see them for what they are, with all their contradictory desires and proclivities. And though we may not always approve of what they do, we see them for who they are, men and women very much like ourselves. Such an insight conditions our response to the real human condition, both as we see it every day and in history.
It provides us with the experience the creative imagination can reference as it explores the possibilities for solving the conundrums of cause and effect with which history presents us. Thus, if an historian is to be something more than a scribbler of facts and a compiler of timelines, he must become something of a storyteller. He must cultivate his creative imagination. The subtitle for this talk is The Role of the Imagination, Sacred and Profane in Understanding the Past. Thus far, we have spoken only of the profane. Now we will briefly touch on the sacred. What is a sacred imagination? It's an imagination that has been formed by the sacral, by the experience of sacred rites, writings, and customs. It is an imagination conditioned by the teachings of the Christian faith. It is an imagination that springs from living that faith. Like any other experience, the experience of the sacred becomes the filter through which we come to understand the world around us, by which we add to that world by artistic creation. A person with such an imagination will see all things in relation to the church, God, and eternity, and will act as if these are realities. He will judge all things by the transcendent. History, too, must be seen through the experience of the sacred, by the knowledge we derive from such experience. The transcendent is implicit in history, the very fact that everything we humans do, we do finally for one purpose, to attain happiness. Men, of course, do not always define happiness in the same way. For some, happiness lies in the possession of wealth. For others, it is found in artistic endeavor. To others, I think happiness equates with physical pleasure. Yet, however we define happiness, we all strive to attain it. In the longing for happiness, we live, move, and have our being. In the Prima Pars Secundia of his Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas discusses the question of human happiness. He demonstrates that men strive after the end of happiness, a unique happiness that is common to all men, and indeed to the entire universe. So it's like he says, we're all striving for this thing called happiness. In some ways, it's common, even though we might have different, understandings of it. He discusses the various goods that men deem to be ultimate happiness: riches, honor, glory, and fame, power, bodily health, pleasure, and virtue. He argues that happiness cannot be found in any created thing. It cannot be found in the operations of the speculative intellect, not even if it could comprehend the entire universe and contemplate the angels in all their beauty and majesty. Ultimately, St. Thomas says, happiness can only be found in what transcends its natural powers, the contemplation of the divine essence. The vision of God alone can slake men's natural thirst for happiness and bring them fulfillment. The lofty tragedy of history is that individuals in human societies strive continually after happiness, but never fully attain it. Seeing this, the historian whose mind and imagination are rooted only in the sublunar realities must always wrestle with the vexing conundrum. If human beings always strive for happiness, why do they never achieve it? If history is merely a tale having an ill-defined beginning and a big bang and a denouement and an ineluctable universal collapse, some Götterdämmerung or Ragnarok, does it really have any meaning? Is history then only the tale of a grim battle against overwhelming powers of destruction? A story of ultimate despair, ending not in a bang, but a whimper. The faith, however, gives us a different interpretive key to history. It tells us why human beings never fully attain to happiness in this world. More, it tells how men and nations may ultimately attain happiness. But greater still, the faith has revealed to us a mystery wider than the heavens and deeper than the sea, the magnum sacramentum, that in the dispensation of the fullness of times, it is God's will to reestablish all things in Christ. History, we learn, is not aimless or utterly random. This does not mean that chance and freedom play no part in it, nor conclude that every human and natural event is determined by an inexorable fate. Rather, it assumes that history is the work of a master storyteller, whose characters act out of the roles assigned to them with a self-moving radical freedom. History has its own complication, not of the storyteller's making, but by his sufferance. It has a climax, and will have its denouement, a final triumph of happiness after which all men and creatures strive, and to which they contribute, whether they will to or not. This storyteller's art is awesome in the proper sense of the word, for its protagonists can work contrary to the plot conceived, and yet their insubordination bring it to its foreordained conclusion. We call the truly divine art that can compose such a story that is at the same time history, providence. The faith thus confirms the hunch embedded in all human stories and witnessed to by history, that we have lost a treasure and have been spending our lives, our entire history, trying to find it. But more than that, the faith reveals to us what that treasure, our true happiness is. The vision of God in and through Christ Jesus our Lord. Equipped with this interpretive tool, the historian can use his creative imagination to explore the deepest meaning of historical events and of history itself. He will not be able to understand the genius of every historical event, but at the least he will know this, that history is not some tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Rather, it is a story conceived by a master creator, who by his providence working in and through human freedom will gather all the loose strands of human striving and join them in a resolution that eye cannot see, nor ear hear, nor the heart of man comprehend. The joy that awaits all those who love him and seek to know his ways.